The sky had been darkening since the afternoon, heavy clouds rolling in like an advancing army, their shadows stretching over the quiet countryside. By the time Emma Carter began her drive home, the first droplets of rain had already splattered against her windshield, and within minutes, the sky unleashed a torrential downpour. The wipers struggled to keep up, swiping furiously against the glass, yet visibility remained poor. Emma tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles whitening. She hated driving in storms. The road, slick with rainwater, glistened under the weak glow of her headlights, and the trees that lined the narrow path swayed violently in the wind, their branches clawing at the sky like desperate hands. As she navigated a bend near Willow Creek, a flash of movement caught her attention. A group of crows circled near the drainage pipe beneath the old wooden bridge, their black feathers shimmering as they cawed aggressively. Something about their behavior unsettled her. Crows were scavengers. They often gathered where death lingered. A sense of unease prickled at the back of her neck. She knew she should keep driving. The storm was worsening, and stopping now was dangerous. But her instincts wouldn't let her ignore it. With a sigh, she slowed the car and pulled over to the side of the road. The sound of the rain hammering against the roof filled the silence, the rhythmic pounding blending with the distant growl of thunder. She hesitated for a moment, staring at the birds through the streaked windshield. Then, with a determined breath, she grabbed her raincoat from the passenger seat and stepped out into the storm. The cold was immediate, seeping through her clothes as the wind lashed at her. She pulled the hood over her head and made her way toward the bridge, her boots sinking slightly into the muddy ground. The crows scattered as she approached, their wings beating against the heavy air, but they didn't go far. They perched on the branches above, watching her with sharp, beady eyes. Emma's heart pounded as she peered into the rushing water below. At first, she saw nothing but the churning currents, swollen and furious from the storm. Then, just beneath the bridge, she spotted it, a dark mass caught against the metal grate of the drainage pipe. Her breath caught. It wasn't debris. It was an animal. A small, limp body, barely moving. A surge of adrenaline shot through her. Without thinking, she scrambled down the embankment, slipping on the wet grass as she fought to get closer. The current roared in her ears, the force of the water threatening to pull the tiny creature under at any moment. "Hang on," she murmured, her voice lost in the storm. Reaching out, she grasped onto the wet fur, her fingers brushing against the icy water. The animal flinched weakly, its body barely responsive. With a grunt of effort, she pulled it free from the grate, cradling it against her chest as she staggered backward. The moment she held it, she realized what it was, a lynx cub, no older than a few months. Its fur was soaked, its body trembling violently. Its small paws twitched, but its eyes remained shut, its breath shallow and uneven. Emma's heart clenched. "You're going to be okay, little one," she whispered, tightening her grip as she turned and hurried back toward her car. The crows watched her departure in eerie silence, their heads tilting as if observing something profound. She didn't have time to think about them. She had to get the cub to safety, fast. Emma hurried back to her car, her breath coming in short gasps as she shielded the tiny lynx cub against the relentless downpour. The animal barely stirred in her arms, its body limp and cold. She could feel its weak heartbeat against her palm, each faint thump a desperate fight against the grasp of death. Slamming the car door shut behind her, she turned up the heat, hoping to warm the shivering creature. The storm outside continued its furious assault, rain drumming against the roof, lightning slicing through the darkness. The crows, still perched in the nearby trees, remained unnervingly still, watching her with unblinking eyes. Emma wrapped the cub in her spare hoodie and placed it gently on the passenger seat. Her mind raced. Should she take it home? Find a vet? She had little experience with wild animals, but leaving it out here would be a death sentence. Just as she reached for her phone to search for the nearest wildlife rescue center, movement outside caught her attention. She froze. A shadow flickered beneath the bridge. At first, she thought it was just the wind shifting the trees, but as she squinted through the rain-streaked windshield, she saw it again, a figure, barely visible in the darkness. Emma's pulse quickened. Was someone there? Taking a deep breath, she reached for her flashlight and stepped back out into the storm. The rain had soaked through her clothes completely by now, but she hardly noticed. The unease in her chest grew with every step she took toward the bridge. The wind howled through the trees, sending water spraying in all directions. She shone the beam of light under the bridge, her fingers tightening around the flashlight. And then she saw it. A man lay half submerged in the mud, his body motionless. His clothes were torn and drenched, his face obscured by wet strands of dark hair. For a split second, Emma's breath hitched. Was he even alive? Forgetting all hesitation, she rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him. "Hey! Can you hear me?" she called over the storm. No response. She hesitated only for a moment before reaching out, pressing 2 fingers to the side of his neck. A pulse. Faint, but there. Relief flooded through her, quickly followed by urgency. Who was he? What was he doing out here in the middle of a storm? And more importantly, what had happened to him? She had no time for questions. Digging her hands under his arms, she heaved with all her strength, struggling to lift his dead weight. The mud clung to her boots, the rain blinding her, but she gritted her teeth and forced herself to push forward. Inch by inch, she dragged him up the slippery slope, her muscles screaming in protest. By the time she reached the car, she was gasping for air, her soaked clothes clinging to her like a second skin. She barely managed to shove open the back door and maneuver the man inside before collapsing against the seat herself, panting. Her fingers trembled as she wiped the rain from her face. The cub whimpered softly beside her, and Emma turned to glance at both of them, the tiny, fragile creature curled up in her hoodie, and the unconscious stranger lying motionless in the back seat. She swallowed hard. What had she just gotten herself into? Emma's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she sped through the rain-soaked streets, her heart pounding against her ribs. The tiny lynx cub lay wrapped in her hoodie on the passenger seat, its fragile body barely moving. The soft rise and fall of its chest were the only signs it was still alive. "Hold on, little one," she whispered, glancing at it anxiously. Every second counted. The storm had transformed the roads into slick, treacherous paths. Her headlights barely cut through the curtain of rain, and each turn felt like a battle against nature itself. She fought to keep the car steady, her mind racing. Where was the nearest veterinary clinic? She fumbled for her phone, her fingers slick with rain, and quickly pulled up a location. A 20-minute drive, too long. She had to find another way. A desperate idea took hold. Her old friend, Dr. Lucas Carter, a wildlife specialist, lived only 10 minutes away. She hadn't seen him in years, but there was no time to hesitate. Without another thought, she turned sharply onto a side road, the tires skidding slightly before regaining traction. The cub let out a faint whimper. Emma's chest clenched. "Just a little longer," she promised. The storm raged on as she pulled into Lucas's driveway. She barely had time to throw the car into park before she was out, cradling the cub in her arms as she ran to the door. She pounded on it, her breath coming in short gasps. The porch light flicked on. A moment later, the door swung open, revealing a tall man with disheveled blonde hair and sharp, tired eyes. He blinked in shock. "Emma? No time, help me!" she gasped, shoving the cub toward him. "It's dying." Lucas's hesitation vanished in an instant. "Inside, quickly!" Emma followed him into the house, dripping water all over the hardwood floor, but she didn't care. Lucas had already rushed to his living room, clearing a space on the table before carefully unwrapping the cub. His sharp gaze assessed its condition as he grabbed a stethoscope. "It's weak, but there's still a chance," he murmured. "Get me a blanket, top shelf in the hallway closet." Emma sprinted to the closet, grabbing the softest blanket she could find before rushing back. Lucas had already set up a small oxygen mask, securing it gently over the cub's tiny muzzle. "Dehydrated, underweight, probably abandoned," he muttered, pressing a syringe into its tiny leg. "This should help." Emma barely breathed. "Will it make it?" Lucas didn't answer right away. He adjusted the oxygen flow, his hands moving with practiced precision. After what felt like an eternity, he finally sighed. I don't know yet. But at least now it has a fighting chance. Emma exhaled, only now realizing how tight her chest had been. She sank onto the couch, running a hand through her soaked hair. The events of the night hit her all at once: the storm, the bridge, the cub, and the unconscious man still lying in her car. Her eyes widened. Lucas noticed her expression. What is it? She swallowed hard. There's someone else. A man. I found him under the bridge, unconscious. I brought him here too. Lucas stared at her for a moment, then rubbed a hand down his face. Of course you did. Emma stood abruptly. He might be in danger. Lucas sighed but nodded. Let's get him inside. As they stepped back into the storm, Emma had a sinking feeling that tonight was only the beginning. The storm had not let up. Sheets of rain poured from the sky, drumming against the car as Emma gripped the wheel, her knuckles white. The lynx cub lay wrapped in a blanket on Lucas's lap in the passenger seat, its tiny body barely stirring. Every few seconds she flicked worried glances toward it, searching desperately for any sign of improvement. Lucas's expression was grim. Its heartbeat is weak, he muttered. We need to get to the clinic, fast. Emma pressed harder on the accelerator, the tires splashing through deep puddles as she raced toward the veterinary hospital. The thought of losing the cub after everything they had done made her stomach clench. The unconscious man she had rescued earlier still lay in the back seat, wrapped in another blanket. He had groaned once, but then lapsed back into silence. Emma had no idea who he was or how he had ended up under that bridge, but right now, the lynx cub's survival was her priority. The bright glow of the vet clinic sign appeared through the rain. Emma swung the car into the parking lot, barely putting it in park before she and Lucas rushed out. The glass doors slid open, and the sterile smell of antiseptic and wet fur filled the air. A young receptionist jumped up from her desk, startled by their frantic entrance. We need help, now! Emma called out. A veterinarian, Dr. Rachel Monroe, hurried out from the back room. Her sharp green eyes immediately locked onto the small bundle in Lucas's arms. What happened? She asked briskly, already leading them toward an examination table. Found it abandoned in the storm, Lucas explained as he gently laid the cub down. Severely dehydrated, underweight, barely breathing. Dr. Monroe was already working, her hands moving swiftly as she checked the cub's vitals. Emma held her breath, watching as the vet listened to its heartbeat, then quickly connected it to IN4. A soft beeping filled the room as fluids began to drip into the tiny body. Emma clenched her fists. Will it survive? Dr. Monroe didn't look up. It's critical. We're dealing with severe hypothermia and possible internal issues. But we're not giving up. A tense silence fell over the room as the battle for the cub's life began. Lucas helped set up oxygen support, while the vet monitored its heart rate. Emma stood frozen, her eyes locked on the tiny creature fighting for its life. She could feel her pulse hammering in her throat. Minutes stretched into an hour. The rain continued to lash against the windows. The beeping of the monitors filled the space, an eerie reminder that the cub's fate hung by a thread. Then, a small movement. A faint, trembling breath. Dr. Monroe exhaled in relief. It's responding. Emma felt tears sting her eyes. Lucas let out a slow breath. But it's not out of danger yet, Dr. Monroe warned. The next 24 hours will be critical. Emma nodded, determination tightening her jaw. I'll stay. Lucas met her gaze. So will I. Dr. Monroe gave them an approving nod before turning to check on another patient. Emma finally let herself sink into a chair, exhaustion creeping in. But there was no relief yet. Because in the back of her mind, she knew they still had another mystery to solve. The unconscious man in her car. And the reason he had been left under that bridge. The storm had passed, but a damp chill still clung to the air as Emma and Lucas carefully carried the lynx cub, whom they had decided to call Leo, into her apartment. The little creature was wrapped snugly in a soft blanket, its breathing shallow but steady. The vet had done all she could. Now, it was up to them to keep Leo stable and give him a fighting chance. Emma had never felt this kind of responsibility before. She had rescued stray cats before, but this was different. Leo was not just a pet, he was a wild animal, fragile and clinging to life. And despite her exhaustion, she couldn't shake the feeling that his survival meant more than she understood. Lucas set up a small cushioned area in the corner of the living room, arranging towels and a heating pad to keep Leo warm. Emma gently laid him down, her fingers brushing against his soft, matted fur. The tiny cub barely reacted, only letting out a faint sigh as his body curled slightly into the warmth. "He's still so weak," she whispered. Lucas crouched beside her, his eyes dark with concern. "Dr. Monroe said he needs round-the-clock care. Hydration, warmth, small feedings every few hours." Emma nodded. She had already prepared the special formula the vet had given them. Pouring a small amount into a syringe, she hesitated before carefully bringing it to Leo's mouth. "Come on, little guy," she murmured. At first, there was no response. But after a moment, Leo's tiny pink tongue flicked out, licking at the liquid. Emma's heart lifted. Encouraged, she continued feeding him slowly, careful not to overwhelm him. Lucas exhaled in relief. "That's a good sign." But as the night wore on, worry settled in her chest like a stone. Leo barely moved, his energy almost non-existent. Every few minutes, Emma would check his breathing, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest. She and Lucas took turns monitoring him, dozing off in short intervals, only to wake up in a panic and check on him again. Hours passed in a blur of quiet whispers, careful feedings, and anxious waiting. Then, just before dawn, something changed. Leo stirred. It was a small movement, barely more than a twitch, but to Emma, it was everything. She sat up, her breath catching in her throat. "Lucas, look!" Lucas blinked the sleep from his eyes and leaned closer. Leo's tiny paws flexed slightly, his ears twitched, and for the first time since they had found him, his eyelids fluttered open. A soft, golden gaze met theirs. Emma let out a choked laugh, overwhelmed with relief. "Hey, little one!" Leo gave a weak, almost questioning chirp. It wasn't much, but it was proof that he was still fighting. Lucas grinned. "He's a survivor." Emma reached out, gently stroking his head. "Yeah," she whispered. "And we're not giving up on him." There was still a long road ahead, more sleepless nights, careful treatments, and uncertainty. But for now, hope flickered in the dim morning light, as fragile and precious as the life they were fighting to protect. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a golden glow across the room. Emma sat on the floor beside Leo's makeshift bed, a bundle of soft blankets placed carefully near the heater to keep him warm. She had spent the last few nights in the same spot, afraid to leave him alone for even a moment. Sleep had become a luxury she couldn't afford, not when the fragile little creature before her was fighting for his life. She reached out, gently stroking his fur. It was still coarse and matted in places, but the warmth of his body against her fingers was reassuring. He was no longer the icy cold, barely breathing cub they had found under the bridge. Slowly, he was changing. Lucas entered the room, holding a small dish of warmed milk formula. His tired eyes softened when he saw Emma's unwavering focus on the lynx. "Think he'll take more today?" he asked, crouching beside her. Emma sighed, adjusting the syringe. "I hope so. Last night he drank a little more than before, but it's still not enough." Leo remained curled up, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. For days he had barely moved. He was alive, but barely responsive, as if his body was conserving every last bit of energy just to survive. Taking a deep breath, Emma carefully lifted him. His body was still fragile, light as a feather, but there was a difference now. He felt warmer, not as limp as before. That had to be a good sign. She brought the syringe to his lips, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come on, little fighter. You can do this." At first, there was no reaction. The seconds stretched on, and Emma felt the familiar knot of worry tighten in her stomach. But then, something changed. Leo's tiny mouth parted slightly, his nose twitching at the scent of the milk. A moment later, he latched onto the syringe, his small tongue flicking out as he weakly sucked in the liquid. Emma gasped, her heart pounding. "Lucas, look! He's drinking!" Lucas leaned in closer, watching with wide eyes. "That's huge! He's actually doing it!" For the first time since they found him, Leo was actively seeking nourishment on his own. It wasn't much, his tiny sips were slow and hesitant, but it was progress. Every drop he swallowed felt like a victory. When the syringe was finally empty, Leo licked his lips, a tiny flick of his pink tongue that sent a wave of relief through Emma. She cradled him carefully, his frail body still resting in her hands. Then, as if sensing her gaze, he slowly lifted his head. It was the first time he had attempted to move beyond instinct. His golden eyes, dulled by exhaustion, blinked up at her. Emma felt tears prick her eyes. "Lucas, he's looking at me!" Lucas let out a breathless chuckle. "That's a good sign, right?" She nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "It's more than a good sign. It means he's aware, he's getting stronger." Leo gave a small, barely audible sound, a weak but determined little meal, before curling back into his nest of blankets. He was exhausted from the effort, but Emma knew it was a step forward. Lucas sat beside her, resting his arms on his knees. "He's got a long way to go, but he's a fighter." Emma smiled, brushing her fingers over the soft fur between Leo's ears. "Yeah, and we're going to fight with him." The road ahead would still be difficult. Leo wasn't out of danger yet. But as Emma watched him sleep, his breathing steady, his body warm against the blankets, she knew one thing for sure: he wasn't giving up. And neither would they. The days passed in a blur of careful nursing, sleepless nights, and constant worry. Though Leo had shown the first signs of improvement, his recovery was far from assured. Every morning, Emma and Lucas woke up with the same lingering fear. Would today be the day he got stronger, or the day his fragile body gave in? Leo's condition fluctuated unpredictably. Some mornings, he would drink the milk formula eagerly, his tiny paws twitching as if he wanted to stand. Other times, he refused to eat at all, his eyes barely opening, his body too weak to respond. It was a roller coaster of emotions, hope rising and falling like the tide. One particularly difficult evening, Emma sat beside Leo's makeshift bed, trying to coax him into eating. His body trembled slightly, and she could feel the rapid beat of his little heart beneath her fingertips. He was warm, but something felt off. "Lucas!" she called, her voice laced with concern. Lucas, who had just finished cleaning out Leo's food bowl, rushed over. "What's wrong?" Emma bit her lip. "He feels different. His breathing, it's faster than usual." Lucas knelt beside her, his brows furrowing as he observed the lynx's tiny chest rising and falling rapidly. "That's not normal, is it?" Emma shook her head, panic creeping into her voice. "No, it's not." She quickly grabbed her phone, scrolling through the notes she had taken on Leo's symptoms. Ever since they started caring for him, she had written down every little change, hoping it would help them understand his condition better. She had read about wild animals in distress, how even small infections could turn fatal if untreated. "We need to check his temperature," she muttered, reaching for the small thermometer the vet had given them. Gently, she placed it against Leo's ear and waited. When the number appeared on the screen, her heart clenched. "He has a fever." Lucas ran a hand through his hair, his voice tight with worry. "Damn it! What do we do?" Emma swallowed hard. "We have to cool him down, but carefully. Too fast, and it could shock his system." Together, they prepared a damp cloth, pressing it gently to Leo's tiny paws and ears, the way the vet had instructed them in case of emergencies. His ears flicked weakly at the sensation, but he didn't resist. That worried Emma even more. Leo was usually too restless to stay still for long. "Come on, little guy," she whispered. "Fight through this." The minutes stretched into an agonizing hour. Emma and Lucas took turns holding the damp cloth against his body, whispering words of encouragement as if he could understand them. At one point, Leo gave a soft whimper, his nose twitching slightly. Lucas clenched his fists. He's trying, but what if it's not enough? Emma didn't answer. She refused to believe that after everything they had done, after all the sleepless nights, the desperate efforts, Leo would still slip away. Another hour passed. Then 2. Finally, as dawn broke through the window, Leo's breathing began to steady. His fever had dropped, just slightly, but it was enough to make Emma let out a shaky breath of relief. Lucas sagged against the couch, rubbing his tired eyes. That was too close. Emma nodded, brushing a hand over Leo's fur. Yeah. But he made it through. Leo was still weak, still fragile, but he had survived another night. And as long as he kept fighting, they would fight for him, too. Emma sat on the couch, staring at Leo as he dozed in his cozy little bed near the fireplace. The soft rise and fall of his chest showed he was still recovering, but he was undeniably stronger now. His fur, once dull and matted, had regained a faint sheen. His eyes, once filled with pain and exhaustion, now held a glimmer of curiosity and spirit. Lucas sat beside her, resting his elbows on his knees. He had been quiet for the past few days, just as she had. Both of them knew what was coming, but neither wanted to say it out loud. He's getting better, Lucas finally said, his voice low. Emma nodded. Yeah. He is. There was a long pause before Lucas sighed and leaned back. But that means we have to decide what's next. Emma felt her throat tighten. She knew this conversation was inevitable. They had given everything to save Leo, and now he was strong enough to survive. But that survival came with a painful question: where did he belong? We can't keep him, can we? She whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Lucas hesitated before shaking his head. He's not a house cat, Em. No matter how much we love him, he's a wild animal. He needs to be out there, where he belongs. Emma clenched her hands together. She knew he was right, but the thought of letting Leo go, of not seeing him every morning, of not watching his small victories each day, it felt unbearable. He still needs care, she argued. What if he's not ready? Lucas sighed. That's why we have to talk to the Wildlife Center. They'll know how to help him transition. They can take care of him in a way we can't. Emma swallowed hard, her eyes flickering toward Leo. He was stretching now, his small limbs extending as he yawned. He blinked up at them sleepily before curling into a ball once more. Could she really say goodbye to him? For days she had imagined a future where Leo stayed with them, where he continued to grow in their home, playing in the backyard, curling up on the couch. But that was just a fantasy. He wasn't meant for a life of domestication. Keeping him would be selfish. A lump formed in her throat, but she forced herself to say it. I'll call the Wildlife Center. Lucas reached over and squeezed her hand. It's the right thing to do. That didn't make it hurt any less. A difficult goodbye. The next morning, Emma and Lucas drove to the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, Leo nestled in a secure carrier in the back seat. He had been restless when they put him inside, confused by the change in routine. Emma kept glancing back at him, her heart aching every time he let out a small, questioning sound. When they arrived, a woman named Dr. Claire greeted them. She was a specialist in rehabilitating wild animals and had years of experience with lynxes. He's in great condition, she said after a quick examination. You've taken excellent care of him. Emma forced a smile. We just wanted to give him a chance. Dr. Claire nodded. And you did. Now it's time for the next step. Emma felt Leo's soft fur one last time, tracing the patterns along his ears. Will he be okay here? Dr. Claire smiled reassuringly. We'll slowly prepare him for the wild. He won't be released until he's ready to survive on his own. Emma nodded, biting her lip. She knew this was best for him, but her heart still ached. As they stepped back, Leo looked up at them with wide eyes. He didn't understand what was happening. He let out a soft chirping sound, one he always made when he wanted attention. Emma felt tears sting her eyes. Lucas put a hand on her shoulder. Come on, Em. Taking a shaky breath, she turned away. And as they walked back to the car, leaving Leo in the care of those who could truly give him the future he deserved, Emma whispered, "Be free, little guy." The drive home was silent. But deep down, they both knew they had done the right thing. Leo was going home. The drive home was silent. Emma sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her mind clouded with emotions. The trees blurred past, but all she could think about was Leo, his wide, questioning eyes as they walked away, the way he had chirped for her one last time. Lucas kept his eyes on the road, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He understood Emma's pain, but he also knew they had done the right thing. Letting Leo go had been one of the hardest decisions they had ever made, but it was necessary. "I hope he won't think we abandoned him," Emma finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas sighed. "I think he knows we love him. And he's in good hands. They'll make sure he's ready before he's released." Emma nodded, but the ache in her chest didn't lessen. That night, their house felt unbearably quiet. No soft rustling from Leo's bed, no little chirps as he stretched, no curious eyes watching them from the corner. Emma found herself glancing at the empty spot near the fireplace, half expecting to see him curled up there. Lucas noticed. "You miss him?" "Of course I do." Emma swallowed hard. "I keep thinking, what if he's scared? What if he doesn't understand why we left him?" Lucas wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Animals are stronger than we think. And Leo is a fighter." Emma wiped her eyes and gave a small nod. "I just hope he finds his place out there." Adjusting to life without Leo. Days passed, and slowly, Emma and Lucas tried to return to normal life. But something was missing. Emma found herself hesitating every morning, expecting to check on Leo, to prepare his food, to hear his tiny footsteps as he explored the house. One afternoon, she picked up her phone and called the Wildlife Center. "Hi, this is Emma. I just wanted to check on Leo." "How's he doing?" Dr. Claire's voice was warm. "He's adjusting well. It took him a couple of days to settle in, but he's eating properly and gaining more strength. We've started introducing him to a larger outdoor enclosure so he can build his hunting skills." Emma let out a shaky breath. "That's good. That's really good. He's a brave little one," Dr. Claire added. "You gave him a second chance, Emma. That's something special." After the call, Emma felt lighter. Leo was doing well. He was moving forward. And she needed to do the same. A new purpose. One evening, as Emma was scrolling through her phone, she came across an article about wildlife rescue. Reading about others who had saved and rehabilitated animals, she felt a strange sense of connection. Lucas glanced at her. "What are you reading?" Emma looked up, her eyes thoughtful. "I was thinking, maybe we could do more." He raised an eyebrow. "More?" She hesitated, but then the words came out naturally. "We helped Leo, and it changed everything. What if we could do that for other animals? Maybe volunteer at a rescue center, or even foster animals that need temporary care." Lucas considered it, then smiled. "I think that's a great idea." A warmth spread through Emma's chest. They had saved Leo, and in doing so, he had changed them. Maybe their journey with him was over, but it had led them to something new, a purpose they had never considered before. Leo had found his future. And now, so had they.